Hi, and welcome to part 2 of our introduction to views within Spring Vue and Timeleaf templates. Last time we explored getting up and running with Timeleaf in our Spring Boot project and just the basic mechanics of setting up a controller that can pass control to a view and then passing a simple text field, string field, into that view. Okay, so in this lesson, we're going to dig a lot deeper and we're going to just get our hands dirty with a lot more Timeleaf syntax and a lot more use cases and actually set up some more sophisticated functionality within our application here. So again, please follow along with this lesson. Please code along. Pause the video if you need to, rewind. We want you to go through all these actions with us. For two reasons. One is that practice is the real way to learn these things, and the more you can practice them, the better off you'll be. And two is that we're going to use this application that we build in these lessons in the future, in future lessons, as well as in class from time to time to do some studios. So please do follow along. So recall that our application at this point just displays a single page that says My Cheeses. Again, this is the Cheese MVC application. We want it to have the functionality that a user can create a list of cheeses. They can add cheese with a name and description and have that be displayed for them as well. So, and eventually we'll probably get to the stage of removing cheeses as well. So today we're just going to add the functionality to add cheese to the list and then display the updated list. Okay, first let's just look at what we can do to display a list of cheeses in our template within our view. So I'm going to go to the controller here, and so far our handler only has a single action, which is to add a title attribute to the model. The model, again, this is what passes data into the view. So this title field is accessible within the view, as we've used it right here. And then we return the cheese/index template. Okay. So that's all we've done so far. What I want to do right now is I want to add a little bit more code to pass in a list of cheeses to the view. So let's just go ahead and create an array list that holds strings. Right now we're just going to focus on the names of the cheeses. We won't, we'll eventually get to descriptions and some other data there. But for right now, let's just worry about the names. Okay, so I create a new array list. And let me just add a few cheeses to that list. I'm going to add cheddar. And I'll add Parmesan. And I'll add one more. Let's make this Munster. Okay, so I have a list that contains 3 cheeses. I now want to pass that list into the view. So just like with the title, I can say model.addAttribute and give it a key here. I'm just going to call it cheeses, which is the same thing that I named it locally here as an array list. Okay, so just note that we're doing the same thing. Model.addAttribute will pass data from our controller into our view. Here, previously, we just passed a simple string. Now we're passing an object. Okay, so we're passing something a little bit more complicated, or a lot more complicated than a string, which is an array list. And so we're going to be able to work with this and learn a lot more things about working with Java objects in our views. Okay, so now that this is going to be accessible to our view, let's go into our template and look at how we can access it and how we can display this list. So what I want to do is display an unordered list of all of the cheeses. Okay, so let's go ahead and create some UL tags here. And now I want to be able to loop over the list of cheeses. Okay, so to do that, let's first just put in the HTML element that we're going to want to repeat. So if I have 3 cheeses, I'm going to want to have 3 LI elements, right? Or list item elements. So the thing about Timeleaf and loops is that we always add our loop syntax to the HTML element that we want to repeat. So that syntax is th:\each, and then I have an equal sign and quotes, and this is going to specify just the definition of the loop, what we're actually going to loop over. So this is similar to a for loop in Java, but a little bit different. Let me go ahead and type it out and then we'll explain it. Okay, so I have th:/each cheese colon and then cheeses, but notice this is within the $ curly brackets. So the $ curly brackets tells TimeLeaf to look in the model for this value. Okay, so it's going to look for a value named cheeses within the model. And we indeed have one since we passed one in, so it'll find it. And since it's a list, it will be able to iterate over the list, and this is going to be our iterator variable, cheese, okay? And what I want to happen for each item in the list is I want to create a new li tag that has the name of that cheese as the text for the li. So let me use the th::text and refer to the iterator variable that I have right here. Now, one potential thing that's confusing when you're new to TimeLeaf is that typically we've created for loops by having the code that's carried out for each loop iteration inside of the loop. And here we kind of have both of those in the same line. We kind of have the for loop definition, what we're looping over and what our iterator is, as well as accessing some of that data from the iterator variable. And this is all in the same line. So it's potentially a little confusing. Here's how I recommend you think about this. Whenever we're using the th::each tag or attribute, we are basically saying that we want TimeLeaf to repeat the current elements, which is an li, for each item in the list. Okay, so once again, we are asking TimeLeaf to repeat the current element, the li tag, for each cheese in cheeses. And then we just have to specify what we want it to do to customize or use the value of the iterator within that li tag that it's repeating. And so we can say to insert the text, that's the value of the iterator variable. Okay, so this should work. Let's go ahead and start up our application and test it out. All right, now that we have the Tomcat started successfully message, let's go over to our view. That was from me playing around from last time. So you should see when you go to localhost :8080/cheese, you should see the list of the 3 cheeses that we just created in our controller displayed as an unordered list. And so we know we did that successfully. Okay, that's great. So let's come back to IntelliJ and go ahead and stop the application. We're going to make some changes to our controller. One thing I want to do is show you how to handle a situation where your the data that you're passing in or you expect to be passed in from a controller isn't available. Okay, so let's go back here and let's look at a couple of situations. Let's look at the situation where I actually suppose that just there wasn't anything passed in. Okay, so let me comment that out and I'll come to the controller and I can say that I want to handle this by displaying a brief message. So let me just go ahead and put the message there and we'll see how to conditionally display that message. All right, so the way I can conditionally display this message is saying that th unless this value exists, I want to display the message. So this is essentially kind of like an if not. It's kind of a negation. It's saying if this item does not exist, go ahead and display this message. If it does exist, don't display this tag. Okay, so that will work in the case that we don't pass anything in with that key, with the cheeses key. However, there's also the situation where we pass in a list, it just happens to be empty. Okay, so that's another situation we should think about here. So let's go ahead and look at how we can modify this to deal with that. So I can say unless cheeses, that's going to cover the situation where there is no cheeses item passed in. And the thing I can do to add to this, is to say cheeses and cheeses dot size. Okay, so since cheeses should be a list, I can call the .size method on it to get the size of that list. And I want to make sure that this is saying that cheeses exists and its size is not 0. Okay, so let's go ahead and test this out. Let's see, make sure our data is set up. So here we're indeed creating a list, but not passing anything in. So let's go ahead and start our application and see how we did. All right, there we go. We see the successful start message. Let's go ahead and refresh. And there we see the correct message, no cheese. That's great. Exactly what we had hoped. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my server and go ahead and put things back the way they were. However, I'm going to leave this message here because that'll still be useful to us in the future. All right, so let's go ahead and look at how we can then go ahead and dynamically create a list of cheeses from data that the user has given us. So far, we are just creating a list ourselves here, right? We're just kind of hard coding a specific list, but we want this application to be responsive to the data that the user is entering. So in order to do that, the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that I can allow the user to add a cheese. The first part of that is giving them a place to do that. In other words, a form. So let's go ahead and add a controller method to display a form. So let's say that we want a public string display add cheese form. All right. And this is going to live at, we need to configure the request mapping portion. And we say, let's make this live at the just add URL. And okay, so basically pretty much all the work that this is going to do is it's going to just render the form. So I can return, and I haven't made this form yet, but let's go ahead and decide what we want it to be called. We want it to be called add. All right, and just like my index handler, let's go ahead and add a title. I'm going to need a model object to do that, and I'll say model.add attribute title add cheese. Okay, so there we go. So we're creating just a simple form with the title add cheese, and all this method's doing is sending control to that template. We don't have that template yet though, so let's go create it now. In our templates directory, I'm in templates.cheese. One thing about IntelliJ to note is that you'll see this happen a lot. It seems like this is displaying a folder that is named templates.cheese. However, that's not what's going on. If you were to look at the file system, you would actually see that there is a folder templates, and within it a folder named cheese, but that the only thing in that templates folder is the cheese folder. So basically it's collapsing that view into templates.cheese. So yeah, so just a quick note about that UI aspect of IntelliJ. Go ahead and right click on that though and say new HTML file. We're going to create a new timeleaf template, and we'll call this add, like we specified in our handler. And there we go. I don't know why that did that twice, but there we go. All right, so now we have a basic HTML file here. I want to go in here, and I'm just going to copy and paste what's in my index. And so, you know, being a little bit lazy here, and I can delete all the stuff, the loop and the displaying. The reason I did that is I still want, for every timeleaf template I have, I still want this XMLNS attribute on the HTML tag. That's going to be important to make sure that IntelliJ and the application know the correct syntax that we're using within this file. And then I also want to make sure that, you know, the default file that IntelliJ gives me doesn't have self-closing tags. And so, as I mentioned before, when we're working with timeleaf, we need to conform to the XHTML standards of making sure that every tag is closed. And so if it's a tag like a meta tag that can be self-closing, we need to make sure it's closed with a slash as opposed to leaving it just unclosed that way. All right, so this is the kind of the shell of this. Now that copy pasting, generally we're gonna get away from that, but I'm gonna introduce that in a future lesson about how to use and reuse template components across different templates. You know, notice we have basically the same structure to our template as we do over here. I'm gonna show you how to reuse that in a much better way so you're not copying and pasting. But for now, let's focus on the task at hand. Okay, so here I'm in my add template. I want to create a form for the user to add a cheese. So let's just create a form tag. And I want this form to have method equals post. All right, so we're going to post the data for the form. And I need to add some input elements. So first input element is going to be a text element. So type equals text. And let's give it the name cheese name. Okay, pay attention to the capitalization, the way I've structured this. This will come up in a couple of minutes. All right, and I can, again, close that. I need to self-close it. And then let's add a submit button, input type equals submit. And I want to add a value attribute. And so the value attribute on a submit button will customize the text that is displayed on that button. If you leave it off, you'll just get text that says submit. Okay, so that looks good. Our page will have a title and below it a form with a text input and a button, which is exactly what we want. Let's make sure we did everything on our controller to set that up properly. Looks like that's good. Let's go ahead and fire up our server and see how we did. All right, once Tomcat's started, bounce back over to your application. And here we need to go to the URL /cheese/add. All right, that looks pretty good. So we have our correct title, a single text element, and a button. Okay, so let's come back to IntelliJ, stop the server, and let's work now on the form processing. So this is the form display. We have a handler to display the form. Now we want to create a handler to process the form. So let's say public string process add cheese form. Okay, so that's what our method's going to be named. And let's use the same request mapping setup here. All right, so what this is basically saying is if we go back to our form in the time leaf template, we notice that there's no action attribute on the form. So when we first learned about forms, we learned that we can put an action attribute and we can give that, some kind of URL, something like this maybe, and that will be the place that the form is submitted to. In other words, when the user hits the submit button, the browser will send that request to the URL specified by the action attribute. However, it's a common pattern to have that request be submitted to the same URL that the form lives at. And you can basically achieve that by leaving off the action attribute. By default, the action will be to submit the form to the same URL at which the current form is displayed. So over here, we would be saying, by leaving off the action attribute, that the browser should submit the form. A little bit of a tongue twister there. The browser should submit the form to /cheese/add. Okay, and that's going to work for us because we've specified that the method should be post. And so we over in our controller, even though we have the same URL routing scheme set up for both of these handlers, we can be a little bit more specific and specify the request method that should be submitted to each one. So the display of the form is going to be a GET request. The processing of the form is going to be a POST request. Okay, so that will align those different request types up just right. And again, this is a common pattern for displaying and submitting a form to have them both at the same URL, with the GET request being the display and the POST request being the processing. For our processing of the form, we need to do a couple of things. One is we need to get data out of the request. So in a previous lesson, we saw that we could do this using the HTTP servlet request object. So let's look at how we can do that, and then I'll show you a different way that's a little bit more Spring-like and that we'll use more commonly throughout the rest of the course. So to do this, we would say string cheese name equals request dot get parameter, and then we would give it the name of the parameter that was passed in. So here, cheese name, this guy specifies the attribute name, the key name of the data that's passed in. So this needs to match this, okay? And the request will then look for a parameter named cheese name and put it into this local variable. Okay, so this is how we first introduced this, and this is much more similar to how we did things when we were working with Python web applications, right? However, there's a way that's a little bit more Spring-like that uses the machinery of Spring in a slightly cleaner way that we want to introduce now. So this technique is not exclusive to Spring. This is kind of using the servlet request as an object that's part of the Java servlets API, which is a little bit of a lower level web application programming interface for working with Java web apps. So this is not inherent to Spring, okay? But Spring still is kind of built on the servlets component of Java. So we can still do this if you want to, and that's okay. I don't think we're going to discriminate that much. However, there's a slightly better way to do this while we're working with Spring, and so let's look at that now. So let me remove this line and remove this from our method signature. And the way we can do this is to use the request param annotation. So I'm just going to enter that in here. And I'm going to say request param. Let me make sure that's imported. Okay, so what this says one is that my controller method, my handler, expects to be passed a parameter that's a string, and we're going to refer to that as cheese name. What the request param annotation does is it says that Spring should look for a request parameter with the same name as the method attribute, or the method parameter rather, and if so, if it finds it, it should insert it into this method call. So there's a little bit of there's some machinery here doing work behind the scenes that we're not going to see, but it's important to note that what's happening here is Spring will look for a request parameter, whether it's a get or a post request parameter, and it will look for it based on the name of your method input parameter right here. And this needs to match this. Okay, this is the name of the parameter that the browser is going to post to our server, and if those two don't match, Spring won't be able to correctly find that data and to hand it to our controller method. Okay, if you're working in a situation where those just absolutely can't match for whatever reason, there's a way to configure this by giving it some additional data, but we're generally gonna leave that off. We'll probably put that in the course notes on how to do that. All right. So this will just kind of hand us directly a string that corresponds to the data that was posted. Now, let's see. Now we want to be able to take that cheese name and add it to a list of cheeses. However, there's a little bit of a problem so far with being able to do that. The list of cheeses we've created so far is a local variable in our index method. Okay? So this is only accessible within this method. I can't get at this list down in this other method. So I want to take this list and remove it from the index method and put it here at the top of your class and just put static before it. So static fields and static members of classes are something we're going to learn very soon, in fact, in the next class. For now, just note that this is necessary to make this list properly accessible to our methods here. Okay, so once I do that, I also just want to go ahead and remove this hard-coded list of cheeses. We're going to add them through our form, so we don't want to have that list hard-coded in our controller. Now down here, I can access the cheeses list, and I can add the cheese that was passed in from my form. Okay, so there we go. So that will add a cheese to the list One thing we need to do, we still have an error. Notice the red squiggly and the red line on the right. I have not returned anything, or a template or a redirect. In this case, what I do want to actually return a redirect. Okay. And the syntax I'm using here, so we've seen redirects before, redirect colon, and then what I would typically put there is a view name. Okay. But I'm not putting a view name here. I want it to redirect to basically /cheese, the way we have our application set up currently. However, since I'm in the cheese controller where we have this URL prefix on all of our paths, by leaving this empty, it's saying basically to redirect to this handler, okay? And so that's going to be the net effect of that. So the redirect is relative to any request mapping that I've configured on my controller here. And then, yeah, as before, this will just display the list of cheeses, before in the same behavior, even though we don't have that list hard-coded, the same behavior is in place. So let's go ahead and fire up our server and see how we did. All right, start it up. So I'm going to go here and just refresh to make sure that everything's working properly on the add form. We didn't make any changes to this, of course, but okay. I'm going to type in a cheese and hit add cheese, and there we are. We're at the URL /cheese. So just to confirm, to reiterate, that we were redirected to within the controller the path that was empty. That path that's empty within this controller has the prefix cheese still, right? And corresponds to the index method. And then we also saw that the cheese that we just typed in was added to our list. So I'd like to go ahead and add a few more while we're working here. It would be nice, wouldn't it be nice to just have a little link here to add cheeses? Let's go ahead and add that link. Let me go to the index templates, and here I'll just put href equals /cheese /add. We'll say add cheese. And since I only made a change to the template, I don't have to restart my server. Let's just go ahead and see that that's true. Great. So let's go ahead and add a cheese, add another one, and another one. Great. That's pretty cool, right? So yeah, so we're kind of building up these skills that we've learned in the context of Python in a new context, which is using Java and using Spring Boot. And the concepts behind them, though, handling get and post requests, routing, form processing, all these concepts are the same as we've seen previously. Even the MVC organization of things is the same as we saw in the Python world. So really, you're focusing on learning the new machinery of the Spring Boot framework and the Java language and how to use that to apply the same abstract concepts of a web application and a web application framework here. Okay, so one more note before we conclude this lesson is that the way that we built up this list of cheeses is as a static member, what's referred to as a static member of the cheese controller. So static and member, these are still fairly new terms. It's just a note. I know it's hard to learn a language when we constantly refer to things that we haven't learned yet. This is one of just the facets of learning Java, that it's really hard to get started with Java and until you are just using things that you haven't quite learned. So we're going to cover all of these things. I promise you, we're going to talk about statics. We're going to talk about fields and classes very soon. So just hang on. But I just want to explain that when we are using an array list in this way, this data will only exist while our application is running. This array list only exists in the current memory for the application. If I stop that application, it gets removed from memory and this list goes away. So this is not any kind of substitute for using a database to persist your data. So let's just go ahead and observe that this is true. I'm going to restart the application. You can restart in IntelliJ by hitting this top button, which is the combination of a stop and start arrow. And then we'll restart and we'll see that our list goes away. So I just want to make sure that you, one, understand that this happens, and two, aren't surprised by it when you are working on this on your own. All right, so we'll come back and refresh. And there we go, no cheese. Okay, so one last thing we want to do before we leave this lesson is I have failed to add this to version control. So we have this project we've been working on. We made a bunch of changes. We should, it's past due actually. This is something that would have been better done at the outset of the project, but better late than never. Let's go ahead and add this to version control so we can keep track of our changes. So go to VCS and enable version control integration. Select Git from the dropdown. That will create an empty Git repository in this project directory. So open up the version control tab. We see that we have a bunch of files that are labeled as unversioned. This means that Git is not tracking these files for changes. We want it to do so. And just another note before we add these, note that there's already a git ignore file. We manually added a git ignore file previously when we looked at using Git with IntelliJ. But when you pull down this package structure from the Spring initializer, the start.spring.io site, you will get a git ignore file for free as part of that. And this has basically all the stuff we're going to need for now to ignore the proper project files. Okay, so just a note there, we don't have to do that step because it's already provided for us. There might be a time in the future where we want to change this, but we can just add it to what's already there. So go ahead and select all of these files and then right click and say add to VCS. So now they've gone from red to green. You'll get used to the colors that IntelliJ uses to indicate the status of files with respect to the local Git repository. Red means a file is not tracked. Green means a file is tracked. And let's go ahead to just commit all of these. Okay, so I'm going to say this is the initial commit and commit. And I notice I did not commit and push. That's because while we set up a local Git repository, we did not connect it to a remote, so there's nowhere to push to. If you want to go ahead and connect this to your remote, in other words, if you want to go set up a GitHub project for this and connect it locally to that GitHub project, you can do that, and the steps are the same as we saw in the lesson on using Git in IntelliJ, so we'll leave that up to you. Okay, but now I have at least my initial project work committed to version control, and we'll be better about using version control as we go through these lessons in the future.